It was supposed to be a routine flight. A black man, dressed casually but neatly, boarded his plane, found his seat, and prepared for the journey ahead. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until a flight attendant began casting uneasy glances in his direction. Minutes later, security approached his row. Without explanation, he was asked to leave the aircraft. Confused but composed, he complied, stepping off the plane as whispers rippled through the cabin. The humiliation was palpable. Heads turned, assumptions were made, but what no one realized, what even the flight crew didn't know, was that the man being escorted out wasn't just another passenger. 7 minutes later, as he stood in the terminal, his phone buzzed. A message appeared. "Congratulations. You've been appointed CEO of Atlantic Airlines." The same airline that had just removed him from his flight. What happened next shook the entire industry. The man, now the head of the company, took a stand not just for himself but for every person who'd ever been judged by their appearance rather than their worth. Stay tuned. This is a story of resilience, power, and the kind of justice that leaves a lasting impact. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from today. If this story inspires you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of triumph and transformation. Marcus Gaines boarded the plane the way a man steps into a room he's been in 1,000 times before, quietly, unobtrusively, with no expectation that he would be remembered once he left. The flight from New York to Chicago was as routine as the sunrise. And Marcus, ever the professional, dressed the part: dark slacks, a pressed white shirt, and a navy blazer that carried the faint scent of cedar from his closet. He wasn't flashy, nor did he try to be. Years of maneuvering through corporate boardrooms had taught him that attention, when undeserved, was more of a liability than a gift. Marcus took his seat by the window, allowing the hum of the cabin to settle around him as he pulled out his phone to check emails. The other passengers filtered in: families, businessmen, students with headphones already firmly in place. The air held that peculiar weight of shared anonymity. But Marcus had long since grown accustomed to the silent separations that accompanied spaces like these. As the flight attendant passed his row, Marcus caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, fleeting, but present. He had seen that look before, many times. A glance that paused just a beat too long. A thread of quiet calculation weaving behind polite professionalism. He smiled, a small, generous offering, meant to diffuse the unspoken. But the smile was not returned. Instead, the flight attendant's gaze lowered, and she quickly moved on. Marcus thought nothing of it, at first. After all, people were strange. They carried their discomforts in invisible bags, and you never really knew which ones were heavy enough to make them stumble. But as the minutes passed, Marcus couldn't help but notice how often she glanced back in his direction. Her eyes were not kind. They were assessing. It was subtle, but unmistakable. 15 minutes later, the plane had filled, and Marcus turned his attention to the clouds gathering outside the small oval window. He barely noticed the flight attendant return, not until her voice dropped just below the threshold of ordinary conversation. "Excuse me, sir." He looked up, expecting a simple inquiry, a check-in, perhaps, or an offer for pre-flight refreshments. But there was a tension in her shoulders, a stiffness that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable standing there. "We need to ask you to step off the plane for a moment." Marcus blinked, feeling the familiar knot tighten in his chest. He had been here before. Not on this plane, not in this exact scenario, but he knew the pattern. "Is there a problem?" he asked, keeping his voice even, soft, the way one speaks to someone holding something fragile. "There's just a small issue," she replied, her words wrapped in the kind of vagueness designed to prevent follow-up questions. "Security will explain everything." Security? Of course. Marcus exhaled slowly and rose to his feet. As he moved toward the front of the plane, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes following his steps. He had felt this before, too. The heat of collective judgment pressed against his back, burning like a brand he could not remove. Some passengers whispered behind cupped hands. Others avoided his gaze entirely, pretending to busy themselves with overhead compartments or the flickering screens embedded in the seats ahead of them. When Marcus reached the gate, 2 uniformed security officers were waiting. "Sir, we'll need you to step aside for a few questions," one of them said. His tone was neutral, but Marcus had long since learned how to read between the lines. "Has there been a misunderstanding?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "There's been a report of suspicious behavior," the officer replied. Marcus's jaw tightened. He could see the flight attendant standing near the counter, hands clasped, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. Suspicious behavior. The phrase hung in the air, bloated with unspoken implications. It did not matter that Marcus had checked in without issue, passed security like every other traveler, or presented nothing unusual. Suspicious behavior had no definition, because it was not a matter of action, but of perception. He thought, briefly, of the articles he had read, stories of men like him, escorted off flights for reasons that could never quite be explained, reasons that evaporated like mist once the investigation concluded. But Marcus knew the drill. He wasn't about to raise his voice, wasn't about to demand answers. The only thing louder than anger in situations like these was silence. "Of course," Marcus said, stepping aside with the kind of practiced ease that spoke of repetition. But as he followed the officers down the terminal, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket. When he glanced at the screen, Marcus stopped. There, in the pale glow of his messages, was a single text from the chair of Atlantic Airlines board of directors. "Congratulations, Marcus. The vote was unanimous. You're officially our new CEO." Marcus stared at the words, his fingers tightening around the edges of his phone. Funny how life worked. Just minutes ago, he was another nameless face on a plane, a man whose worth had been measured, and found wanting, by the flight attendant who stood across the room. And now, in the span of a heartbeat, Marcus Gaines was no longer a passenger. He was the most powerful man in the airline. The security officers slowed, confused by Marcus's sudden stop. But Marcus smiled then, not the small, diffusing smile he had offered before, but something deeper, something older, a smile that knew the weight of history, and the inevitability of its turning tides. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, tucking his phone back into his jacket, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The waiting area outside Gate 17 was a curious kind of limbo, a space that seemed to exist beyond time, where conversations felt hushed, and eyes flickered cautiously over unfamiliar faces. Marcus Gaines sat in one of the hard plastic chairs by the window, watching the plane he'd just been escorted from grow smaller in the distance as it taxied toward the runway. There was no scene, no raised voices. The security officers had simply stepped back once Marcus showed them the text. They mumbled apologies wrapped in bureaucratic detachment, the kind that placed the weight of error on no one in particular. But Marcus had seen their faces shift, subtly, as they realized who he was. A flicker of recognition, or was it embarrassment? That came too late to mean much of anything. Marcus didn't bother asking for an explanation. He had stopped counting how many times he'd seen that same tired look, the careful calibration of respect when the error became clear. The apology that said, "We didn't know you were important," as if dignity were a prize reserved for the select few. He wasn't interested in apologies. The chair beside him creaked as an older white man settled into the seat. He wore a faded ball cap that read Korean War Veteran, the letters fraying at the edges. His hands, wrinkled and steady, rested on a cane with a brass eagle perched at the top. The man said nothing at first, just nodded toward the window where the plane was now lifting into the pale winter sky. "Missed your flight?" the man finally asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Marcus considered the question. "Not exactly," he replied, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The old man chuckled softly. "Ah, I see. The old, random security check trick." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the candor. "It's not so random when it happens more than once," Marcus said, leaning back in his seat. The veteran nodded knowingly, his grip tightening on the cane. "Son, I've been living long enough to know that the world doesn't hand out random to men who look like you and me. They call it protocol, but we both know what it is." Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was strange, the quiet relief that came from being seen without needing to explain. But relief was fleeting. Marcus's phone vibrated again, this time with a message from David Sorensen, the outgoing CEO. "Marcus, let's meet at HQ first thing tomorrow. The board's excited. We need to talk transition." Transition. It was such a clean word. Marcus thought, smooth, efficient, like the polished glass walls of the corporate office. But Marcus knew transitions were rarely smooth. He could already feel the undercurrent of resistance waiting for him at headquarters. Some would hide it better than others, dressing it in the language of concerns and adjustments. But Marcus had spent too many years learning how to read the unspoken. And that was the thing about the board's excitement, it wasn't unanimous. Marcus could hear the quiet doubts that some wouldn't dare say aloud. They liked his vision, they admired his strategy, but there was something else, an unspoken calculation happening behind closed doors. Could he lead? Would clients see him the same way? Would employees follow? Those weren't questions they asked about the other candidates. The next morning, Marcus walked through the revolving glass doors of Atlantic Airlines headquarters. The lobby was sterile, bathed in cold fluorescent light. "Good morning, sir," the receptionist said with polite efficiency, her eyes flickering over his name badge as if double-checking that he belonged there. Marcus nodded, his gaze catching the subtle pause, the half-second where she hesitated. As if some part of her had not expected him to wear that title. CEO. It sat uncomfortably on her tongue, though she masked it well. The executive floor was quiet, save for the soft murmur of phones and keyboards. Marcus entered the conference room where Sorensen and the board were already seated. Conversations hushed as Marcus stepped inside. "Marcus," Sorensen greeted, rising to shake his hand. "Welcome." But Marcus caught the way Sorensen's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, scanning him as if he were a puzzle missing a piece. It was subtle, always subtle, the lingering air of disbelief that shadowed every interaction. As the meeting began, Sorensen ran through quarterly projections and upcoming challenges. Marcus listened carefully, noting the places where Sorensen glossed over issues: labor negotiations, customer satisfaction drops, and, of course, the quiet but growing dissatisfaction within the workforce. When the meeting opened for questions, Marcus leaned forward. "I noticed the retention numbers in the operations division have dropped by nearly 12%. Marcus began. "What's driving that?" Sorensen's expression stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Operational concerns," Sorensen replied carefully. "We're looking into it." Marcus met his gaze, holding it steady, respectfully. "David, I think the concern is clear." Marcus's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years spent recognizing patterns others pretended not to see. "Employees feel overlooked. There's a reason we're seeing higher turnover. And I don't think it's just about wages. There's a gap between leadership and the front line." A quiet tension settled over the table. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sorensen leaned back, his expression unreadable. "We'll take it under advisement," he said, with the kind of polite dismissal Marcus had heard too often. But Marcus wasn't finished. "With all due respect, David," Marcus said, sitting taller in his chair, "taking it under advisement isn't enough. We can't afford to treat this like a footnote in the quarterly report. If we don't address the culture now, the numbers are going to keep dropping." A long silence followed, and Marcus saw it, the flicker of unease crossing Sorensen's face. The kind that came when someone realized the man across the table wasn't going to play by the usual rules. Later that afternoon, as Marcus rode the elevator down to the lobby, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a senior board member. "Good call today. Keep pushing." Marcus smiled faintly. The plane may have left without him yesterday. But Marcus Gaines wasn't planning on staying grounded. Marcus Gaines had learned, long ago, that success did not grant immunity. Titles, accolades, and corner offices could be impressive armor. But armor did not stop shadows. They slipped in through the cracks, lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to remind you of the weight you carried. The weight that people like Marcus were not allowed to forget. It was his third week as CEO, and already the corridors of Atlantic Airlines felt tighter. He could see it in the way conversations slowed when he entered the room. In the lingering gazes of department heads who had mastered the art of silent skepticism. They watched him carefully, not out of curiosity, but out of doubt wrapped in the thin veil of professionalism. It was never overt. No one dared to voice their discomfort. Not in words. Instead, it lived in the pauses between handshakes and the half-second delays in returned emails. But Marcus felt it. He always did. He stood by the window of his office that morning, coffee cooling untouched on his desk, eyes fixed on the skyline. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," Marcus said, turning to see Aaron Marshall step inside. Erin was one of the few executives Marcus trusted. A sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s. She had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of corporate America, and she carried the kind of blunt honesty Marcus found rare and refreshing. "We've got a problem," Erin said, closing the door behind her. "The pilots' union is threatening to walk if we don't address the shift policy." Marcus nodded slowly. "I read the memo. They don't think you'll handle it," Erin added, with the directness Marcus appreciated but rarely enjoyed. "They think you'll cave to the board. Sorensen never backed them. They assume you won't either." Marcus folded his arms, leaning against the edge of his desk. "And what do you think?" Erin's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for a sign of hesitation. "I think you'll handle it," she said, finally. "But I also know they're not ready for someone like you to be the one giving orders." Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "They'll have to adjust," he replied, though he knew Erin wasn't wrong. The meeting with the pilots' union was scheduled for that afternoon. When Marcus entered the boardroom, the tension thickened immediately. There were 6 of them, all seated along one side of the table. 5 of the 6 were white men, most older, their hands clasped in front of them with the tight-knuckled grip of men who had been waiting for an excuse to push back. Captain Lewis, the union representative, leaned forward first, a veteran pilot in his 60s. Lewis' presence dominated the room not because of his words, but because of the quiet authority that often comes with years of unchallenged power. "Mr. Gaines," Lewis began, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Marcus recognized the tone immediately. Polite, measured but distant. "This company doesn't run without you," Marcus said, cutting through the pleasantries. "I'm aware of that. I'm here because I believe we can find a path forward that works for everyone." Lewis' eyes flickered for a brief moment, as if measuring the sincerity in Marcus's words. "I'm not so sure the board shares that view," Lewis replied. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'm not here to speak for the board. I'm here to speak for this company, and right now. This company needs solutions, not more tension." One of the other pilots shifted in his seat. The weight of unspoken grievances filled the room like smoke. "We're prepared to strike," Lewis said finally, his voice firm but calm. "We don't take that lightly. But if the policy doesn't change, we'll walk." Marcus nodded slowly, letting the silence settle before he spoke. "Striking would hurt the company," Marcus said, "but let me be clear, I understand why you're ready to do it. And I won't stand in the way of what you feel is necessary to be treated fairly." A flicker of surprise crossed Lewis' face. "But," Marcus added, leaning forward, "I don't think that's the answer. I think we can reach an agreement without forcing this company into crisis. I know what it feels like to be overlooked, and I don't plan on making a career out of doing that to other people." The words hung there, heavier than the room had expected. For the first time, Lewis' posture shifted, just slightly. It was a small thing, but Marcus recognized it. The crack in the wall. Later that evening, Marcus walked through the empty hallways of the building, his footsteps echoing softly. The pilots hadn't agreed yet. Not fully. But Marcus knew something had changed during that meeting. It was not victory. Not yet, but it was movement. As he stepped into the elevator, Marcus thought about his father. A man who had worked construction for 30 years, only to be passed over for promotions that never seemed to materialize. A man who taught Marcus that success was rarely about talent alone. "It doesn't matter how sharp you are, son," his father once said. "Some rooms were built without you in mind. But that doesn't mean you don't belong in them." Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. He wasn't sure if he belonged in this room, not yet. But he was already inside. And that, Marcus thought, was enough for now. The corridors of Atlantic Airlines headquarters carried the same energy as a crowded train station, constant movement, hushed conversations, and the unspoken knowledge that everyone was going somewhere, even if they didn't know the destination. Marcus Gaines walked those corridors like a man who had memorized every turn and shadow. But even the most familiar paths felt different now. His name was etched on the CEO's door. His title echoed in corporate memos. But he could feel the resistance humming beneath the surface, subtle, patient, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. It wasn't loud. It rarely was. The first sign of rebellion came quietly, disguised as routine. Marcus was reviewing quarterly reports when Erin Marshall appeared at his office door. Her expression tighter than usual. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "They stalled the technology upgrade," she said, stepping inside and lowering her voice. IT sent the request to finance. But it's been sitting on someone's desk for a week. Marcus didn't look up from the report. Whose desk? Aaron hesitated, which told Marcus all he needed to know. Let me guess, John Peterson. Peterson had been with the company longer than Marcus had been alive. He was part of the old guard, those men who remembered Atlantic Airlines when it was little more than a regional carrier. Back when decisions were made over scotch and leather-lined offices. Peterson hadn't said much when Marcus was appointed. He didn't need to. Marcus could read his silence the way a sailor reads the wind. I'll handle it, Marcus said, closing the file. Erin's lips tightened. She looked at him the way someone looks at a man about to step into traffic. Careful, she said. Peterson doesn't fight in the open. He waits. Marcus smiled faintly. So do I. Later that day, Marcus found Peterson in the executive lounge, nursing a cup of coffee as he stared out at the tarmac below. John, Marcus greeted, sitting across from him. Peterson glanced up, offering the kind of polite smile men give when they know the conversation isn't optional. Marcus, Peterson replied, his tone even. What can I do for you? Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady. I understand you have the IT request for the technology overhaul. I wanted to check in. Peterson took a slow sip of coffee. It's a complex proposal, Peterson said carefully. A lot of moving parts. We're just making sure everything's in order before we move forward. Marcus nodded slowly, letting the words settle between them. I appreciate diligence, Marcus said, but I'm sure you understand the urgency. Our current system's outdated. If we wait too long, the competition won't just catch up, they'll pass us. Peterson folded his hands, resting them on the table. His wedding ring glinted under the fluorescent lights. We've always been careful about rushing into things, Peterson replied, his voice smooth, practiced. Atlantic Airlines was built on patience. Careful decisions. That's why we're still standing. Marcus smiled thinly, recognizing the message beneath Peterson's words. Patience, Marcus repeated, letting the word linger. Funny thing about patience, John, it's a luxury, and it's rarely extended to people like me. Peterson's smile didn't falter, but Marcus caught the flicker of tension behind his eyes. I'm sure that's not the case, Peterson replied, though the slight edge in his voice betrayed him. Marcus leaned forward, his tone soft but unyielding. I think you know it is. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. It was one of those moments Marcus had grown accustomed to where words carried more weight in their absence than in their presence. Peterson exhaled through his nose. A subtle surrender. I'll sign off on it, Peterson said, rising to his feet. But Marcus, don't mistake caution for resistance. Some of us have been here long enough to know that change isn't always as simple as pushing things through. Marcus rose as well, meeting Peterson's gaze head on. And some of us, Marcus replied, have been here long enough to know that pushing is the only reason we're in the room. Peterson didn't reply. He simply nodded, stepping past Marcus and disappearing down the hallway. That evening, Marcus sat in his office. The city skyline stretching out beyond the glass. The technology upgrade had been approved on paper. At least. But Marcus knew this wasn't the last time Peterson, or someone like him, would test the waters. It was never about the upgrade. It was about the slow erosion of authority. The quiet rebellion that worked not by confrontation, but by delay. And Marcus understood that game all too well. He remembered his first job out of college where promotions came slower for him than for others. Where praise always felt conditional. He remembered the boardrooms, the polite nods, the way his suggestions were repeated by someone else, only to be celebrated as new ideas. It was a game of endurance. And Marcus had spent his entire career playing it. He wasn't tired, not yet, but he was more aware than Peterson and the others likely realized. 2 weeks later, Marcus walked into the break room during a staff meeting. Conversations slowed as employees caught sight of him, their polite smiles stretching just a little too thin. Marcus approached a small group of flight attendants by the coffee machine. One of them, an older black woman named Denise, offered a warm but guarded smile. Mr. Gaines, she greeted. Denise, Marcus replied. How's the crew doing? Denise glanced around, lowering her voice. They're doing fine, she said, though Marcus could hear the hesitation behind her words. Marcus leaned in slightly. Tell me the truth, he said quietly. Denise hesitated for a beat, then exhaled. They're watching you, she said softly. Not just the board, the staff. They want to see if you'll last, or if they'll find a way to make sure you don't. Marcus met her gaze, offering a small nod. I figured as much, he replied. Denise studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. Don't let them see you sweat, she said. It makes them nervous. Marcus chuckled under his breath. I never do, he replied. As he left the break room, Marcus felt the weight of every step, the silent battles he'd already fought. And the one still waiting ahead. The rebellion wasn't over. But Marcus Gaines was still standing. Marcus Gaines had long understood that the real battles were never fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. They happened in the quiet spaces, the hushed conversations behind closed doors. The unreturned phone calls, the glances that lingered just a moment too long. By his 5th month as CEO, Marcus could feel the strain tightening around him like a slow, deliberate noose. It wasn't that anyone said the wrong thing outright. Atlantic Airlines had mastered the art of subtlety. This wasn't the South of his father's generation, no signs hung above water fountains. But Marcus had learned that erasure came in many forms. The first indication came in the form of a cancelled meeting. Marcus had scheduled a quarterly review with the regional directors to address the company's stagnant growth in underserved markets, routes that connected smaller, predominantly Black and Latino communities to major hubs. 2 days before the meeting, the email arrived, postponed indefinitely. It read, no explanation, no follow-up. Marcus didn't bother asking who had made the decision. He already knew. John Peterson, ever the patient hand at the wheel, was playing the long game. Marcus found Peterson in the executive dining area the following afternoon, seated comfortably among a circle of department heads. The conversation dipped the moment Marcus approached, as if they had been caught discussing something they weren't prepared to explain. John, Marcus said evenly, I was hoping to catch you. Peterson looked up, his expression polite but unreadable. Marcus, what can I do for you? I wanted to talk about the cancelled market review. Peterson leaned back, folding his arms across his chest as if the conversation bored him. Oh, that. We decided it wasn't a priority for this quarter. There were concerns about profitability. We need to be cautious with expansions right now. Marcus held his gaze. Cautious? He repeated. We've had consistent reports showing those routes could grow if we invest the right resources. Peterson offered a practiced smile, the kind that suggested Marcus was being overly ambitious. Perhaps even naive. I understand your perspective, Peterson said carefully, but the board has other concerns. We can revisit it later. Marcus didn't smile. Later never comes, Marcus replied, his voice measured but firm. Peterson's smile thinned. We're in agreement about the long-term vision, Marcus, but you can't expect everything to change overnight. There's a rhythm to this business. Pushing too hard creates disruptions. Marcus caught the flicker in Peterson's eyes, that quiet warning wrapped in professionalism. Disruptions. Marcus knew exactly what that word meant. The ripple effect. The careful suggestion that his leadership might be too bold. Too fast, too much. It wasn't about market expansion. It was about Marcus himself. That evening, Marcus sat in his office long after the building had emptied. The city lights stretched far below, blinking like distant stars. But the view brought him no comfort. He could hear his father's voice in his head, echoing from long-forgotten conversations. They let you in the door, his father had said once. But they'll watch you the whole time you're standing there, waiting to see if you stumble. His father wasn't bitter when he said it, just tired. Marcus hadn't understood then, but he did now. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Erin Marshall. Still working? She asked when he picked up. For now. Erin paused. I heard about the review. Peterson? Who else? Marcus replied. She sighed. You knew this wasn't going to be easy. Marcus. I know. Good, she said, because they're betting you'll get frustrated and walk away. That's the game, and you know it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. I'm not walking away. Erin, I didn't think you would, she said, her voice softening. But just remember, they don't need to fight you. They just need to make you tired. Marcus was already tired, but he wasn't done. 2 weeks later, Marcus convened a smaller, private meeting with his own staff, the ones who had been pushing for the expansion. Denise, the senior flight attendant who had warned him before, was there. So was Erin. Marcus stood at the front of the room, hands in his pockets as he scanned the faces of the people who had quietly supported his initiatives. "I'm not waiting for the board," Marcus said plainly. "We're moving forward." A murmur of surprise filled the room. Denise raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan on doing that without their sign-off?" she asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "We start small. Focus on community partnerships first. Build the relationships on the ground. By the time the board realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it." Aaron smirked. "That's bold." "It's necessary," Marcus replied, "and it's the only way this changes." Over the next month, Marcus traveled to 3 cities, meeting directly with local leaders, airport authorities, and small business owners. He shook hands, listened to concerns, and laid the groundwork for routes that hadn't been flown in years. No memos were sent to the board. No announcements made. Marcus worked in silence the same way Peterson had tried to erode his authority. But Marcus wasn't eroding. He was building. And by the time Peterson caught wind of it, Marcus knew the foundation would already be too strong to tear down. The real battles, Marcus realized, were rarely about the policies or the numbers. They were about the people. And as Marcus boarded his flight home from the last meeting, he caught the eye of an older black man seated across the aisle. The man nodded, tipping his hat in quiet recognition. Marcus smiled in return, because sometimes, that was enough. Not victory, not yet, but acknowledgement. And Marcus Gaines knew that acknowledgement in a world that so often tried to erase him was its own kind of rebellion. Marcus Gaines had begun to understand that the higher you climbed, the quieter the opposition became. No one yelled from the rooftops. No one stormed out of meetings. Resistance at his level was like smoke, hard to hold, harder to see, but suffocating if left unchecked. It was late January when Marcus returned to Atlantic Airlines headquarters after his quiet expansion initiative in underserved markets. On the surface, everything seemed in order. The board hadn't raised alarms, and there had been no official memo from John Peterson. But Marcus wasn't naive. The silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. The crack appeared during the quarterly shareholder meeting. Marcus stood at the podium, addressing a sea of tailored suits and weathered faces, men and women who measured success by the inch, not the mile. "As we continue to expand our routes," Marcus said, clicking to the next slide, "I'm proud to announce 3 new markets connecting regional airports to our major hubs. These expansions allow us to reach communities we've underserved for years, generating long-term growth in key regions." He could see them shifting in their seats. Not all, but enough. Marcus had read the reports. The routes weren't projected to rake in record profits immediately. But that wasn't the point. This was a long game. And Marcus was playing for something bigger than quarterly spikes. He let the room simmer for a beat before continuing. "This isn't just about revenue. It's about positioning Atlantic as a leader in inclusive growth, ensuring no community is overlooked." That word inclusive landed like a stone in still water. Marcus knew it wasn't the markets they had a problem with. It was the message. When the presentation ended, there was polite applause. Marcus stepped down, shaking a few hands along the way. But he felt the undercurrent gathering beneath the surface. The next day, John Peterson was waiting for him in the executive lounge. Marcus could see it coming from the moment he walked in, the slight smirk on Peterson's lips. The way his arms rested casually along the back of his chair. As if he were already 3 steps ahead. "Marcus," Peterson said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Join me for a second." Marcus didn't bother sitting. "I'm in a rush." "John," Marcus said, tucking his hands into his pockets. "What can I do for you?" Peterson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest that whatever he was about to say wasn't going to be written down. "I wanted to congratulate you," Peterson began, his tone smooth. "Your presentation yesterday was impressive. You got away with words." Marcus waited. "But I wonder," Peterson continued, lowering his voice, "if you're aware of how this looks." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "How it looks?" Peterson smiled, but there was nothing friendly behind it. "The messaging, the focus on underserved markets," Peterson said, choosing his words carefully. "It's admirable. But I hope you're not alienating our core investors. They're not used to hearing words like equity or inclusion in shareholder meetings." There it was. Peterson wasn't criticizing the strategy. He was signaling Marcus that there was a line, an invisible one, and Marcus had stepped over it. Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his gaze locked on Peterson. "I'm not here to manage anyone's discomfort, John," Marcus replied. "I'm here to grow the company. And last I checked, growth doesn't alienate investors." Peterson's smile flickered, but he held his ground. "Just be careful," Peterson said, rising to his feet. "Not everyone appreciates having their hand forced." Marcus stepped aside, watching Peterson walk toward the elevators. Forced. Marcus turned the word over in his mind as he left the lounge. It wasn't force. It was recognition. And the only people who felt threatened by recognition were those who feared losing a piece of something they never had to fight for. By mid-February, Marcus began to notice the fractures widening. Budget requests that usually passed without issue were suddenly flagged for additional review. His leadership decisions were quietly questioned in hallway conversations that never seemed to reach his office. And then came the whispers. They weren't loud, but Marcus caught them in passing comments about pushing too hard, about changing things too fast. Marcus could hear it in their voices. The way men like Peterson and his circle spoke as if Marcus's leadership was an experiment. One that would inevitably fail, if they just waited long enough. The final blow came during the leadership retreat in Arizona. The event was meant to be routine 3 days of strategy sessions, networking, and team-building exercises at an upscale desert resort. On the second evening, after a long day of meetings, Marcus found himself standing alone at the bar during the company reception. He could hear them from across the room before they noticed him: Peterson and 2 other executives, laughing softly over half-empty glasses of bourbon. Marcus wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but sometimes the truth didn't bother hiding. "You have to admit," Peterson said, his voice low but clear, "there's something ironic about him pushing those diversity initiatives when half our staff already thinks they're just for show." One of the executives chuckled, swirling the ice in his glass. "Maybe he's hoping it'll keep him around longer." The other said, grinning, "You know how this goes, give it a year or 2. These things have a shelf life." Marcus set his drink down without finishing it. He didn't confront them. He didn't need to. The next morning, Marcus led the day's opening session without mentioning what he had heard. But something in his voice shifted, a weight that pressed against every word he spoke. "I want to be clear," Marcus said, scanning the room. "This company will grow, not by chasing short-term wins, but by recognizing the communities and people we've ignored for too long. That's not a phase or a program. It's the foundation for how we move forward." His gaze lingered on Peterson for just a moment longer than necessary. No one in the room missed it. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his hotel room, staring out at the mountains. He thought about his father again, how he used to drive an extra 5 miles to a different gas station because the one down the road made him wait longer for no reason at all. "Never let them make you small," his father had said once. "Even if they don't see you, stand tall anyway." Marcus smiled faintly to himself. He wasn't tired yet, and he wasn't getting smaller. Marcus' gains had grown used to the glass walls. They were always there, separating him from the people he was supposed to lead, no matter how many hours he worked or how many memos bore his signature. The glass remained transparent but solid, invisible but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of wall you could touch. No, this wall was crafted from the careful way some of his colleagues said his name, like they were holding something sharp in their mouths. It was built from the way certain executives hesitated when he entered the room, as if waiting for someone else to validate his presence. And Marcus knew deep down they were waiting for the day that glass cracked. Not because he had failed, but because failure was expected. By early spring, Marcus's expansion initiative was yielding quiet but steady returns. The new routes in underserved markets were not turning the kind of profit that would make headlines, but they were outperforming projections enough to justify further investment. Yet no one celebrated. In fact, Marcus noticed that his successes were met with silence more often than applause. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but it became clearer with each passing week. The reports he sent to the board were acknowledged but never praised. His victories were treated as lucky breaks, while any hiccups were dissected under a microscope. It was subtle, but Marcus recognized the pattern. Some were waiting not for him to succeed, but for the inevitable stumble. The stumble came on a Monday morning. Marcus was sitting in his office, reviewing financials, when Erin Marshall appeared at his door. Her face was hard to read. but the tension in her posture gave her away. "We've got a problem," she said, stepping inside and shutting the door behind her. Marcus set the papers aside, leaning back in his chair. "What now?" Erin placed a folder on his desk. She didn't sit. "It's about the Phoenix route," she said. Marcus's brow furrowed. The Phoenix expansion had been one of the more ambitious parts of his plan, a route connecting smaller cities in the southwest to Atlantic's main hubs. "What about it?" Erin hesitated, and that told Marcus everything he needed to know. "Peterson's people flagged it for review," Erin said, crossing her arms. "They're claiming operational inefficiencies. There's talk of cutting it entirely." Marcus's jaw tightened. The route wasn't failing. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it was stable, and more importantly, it was beginning to build loyalty among communities that Atlantic had ignored for years. "This isn't about inefficiency," Marcus said quietly. Erin nodded. "No, it's about you." That afternoon, Marcus sat across from Peterson in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Peterson looked comfortable, too comfortable. He sipped his coffee with the ease of a man who had already decided the outcome of the meeting before it began. "I wanted to address the Phoenix situation directly," Marcus began, his tone calm but direct. "I'm hearing rumors that the route's being reconsidered." Peterson set his cup down, folding his hands neatly on the table. "There's no official decision yet," Peterson replied smoothly, "but the numbers aren't exactly promising. We have to prioritize growth." Marcus didn't flinch. "I agree. And that's exactly what we're doing. The Phoenix route is growing. Cutting it now sends the wrong message." Peterson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I understand where you're coming from," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But sometimes, leadership means recognizing when to let go." Marcus held Peterson's gaze, the weight of the moment settling between them like stone. "This isn't about letting go," Marcus said evenly. "It's about control." Peterson's eyes narrowed, but his smile never wavered. "Marcus," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "you're reading too much into this. We all want what's best for the company." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I know exactly what I'm reading, John," Marcus replied, "and I think you do too." For a brief moment, the glass between them felt thinner, as if it might shatter under the weight of unspoken truth. But Peterson, ever the veteran, knew how to maintain the facade. "I'll bring it up at the next board meeting," Peterson said, standing as if the conversation were over. Marcus remained seated, watching as Peterson walked toward the door. Before Peterson could leave, Marcus spoke again. "John," he said softly, forcing Peterson to turn back. "I've been underestimated before. It usually doesn't end well for the other person." Peterson's smile finally faded. The next day, Marcus called a meeting with his operations team. "We're not cutting Phoenix," Marcus said firmly, pacing at the front of the room. "But if the board," one manager began. But Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. "I'll handle the board," Marcus said. "Your job is to make sure this route succeeds. I want better efficiency, tighter logistics, and I want every customer who flies it to feel like they're getting first-class treatment. Make it undeniable." His team exchanged wary glances but nodded in agreement. As the meeting concluded, Erin approached Marcus, waiting until the others had left. "That was bold," she said quietly. "You just told your staff to bet against Peterson." Marcus smiled faintly, the weariness in his eyes betraying the confidence in his voice. "I didn't tell them to bet against Peterson," Marcus replied. "I told them to bet on me." Erin studied him for a moment, then nodded. "They'll follow you," she said. "But Marcus, you know Peterson won't stop." Marcus exhaled. "I know." He glanced at the skyline through the office window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. "They can wait for me to stumble," Marcus said softly, "but I'm not the one who's going to break. The thing about glass walls is that sooner or later, something shatters." It wasn't a grand confrontation or a dramatic boardroom showdown. No voices raised, no fists slammed on mahogany tables. The fall of Marcus Gaines was quieter than that, quieter and more familiar. By the time the rumors started, Marcus wasn't surprised. It began with small things. A missed email here. A meeting he hadn't been invited to there. Little cracks, deliberately placed. By the time Marcus heard whispers of a re-evaluation of his leadership, the glass wall felt closer than ever, almost pressing against his skin. But the breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. After a tense operations meeting, Marcus had stayed late, going over flight data in his office. The building was nearly empty, save for the quiet hum of vacuum cleaners down the hall. His phone buzzed with a notification. An email. Subject: Leadership Review, Confidential. Marcus opened it, scanning the contents with a calmness he barely recognized in himself. Peterson had done what Marcus expected him to do. The board was calling for an internal review and evaluation of Marcus's leadership over the past year. No official allegations, no direct claims of incompetence. Just the suggestion that certain initiatives lacked alignment with shareholder priorities. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was never about the Phoenix route. The next morning, Marcus found Peterson in the executive lounge, holding court with two other department heads. The conversation halted as Marcus approached. "John," Marcus greeted evenly, hands tucked into his pockets. "Mind if we talk?" Peterson set his coffee down, standing with the same practiced ease Marcus had come to expect. "Of course," Peterson said. "Let's step outside." They walked down the corridor in silence until Marcus stopped near the large glass windows overlooking the runway. "I got the email," Marcus said. Peterson folded his arms, offering a sympathetic nod Marcus recognized as pure theater. "It's just protocol," Peterson replied. "Standard evaluation for senior leadership. You know how these things work." Marcus smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I know exactly how they work," Marcus said, turning to face Peterson directly. "And I know this isn't about evaluations. It's about control." Peterson didn't deny it. Instead, he studied Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to offer him the courtesy of honesty. "I don't expect you to understand, Marcus," Peterson said finally, "but not everyone is comfortable with the direction you're taking this company." Marcus met his gaze without blinking. "They're not uncomfortable with the direction," Marcus replied. "They're uncomfortable with who's leading it." Peterson's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the flicker in his eyes, the quiet acknowledgement that Marcus had said what no one else would. "Look," Peterson said, lowering his voice, "you've done well here, Marcus. Better than some expected. But there's a balance to this. You push too hard, and you disrupt things that have been in place for decades. People don't like disruption." Marcus laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "I'm not here to make anyone comfortable, John." Peterson's smile thinned. "Maybe that's the problem," Peterson replied, stepping closer. "The thing is, Marcus, sometimes you can do everything right and still lose." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "I know. But you know what else I know, John?" Peterson raised an eyebrow. "Waiting. I didn't come this far to let men like you write the ending." By the end of the day, Marcus's office felt smaller than usual. He stared out at the city skyline, watching the shadows stretch across the glass towers. He thought about his father, who had spent 3 decades working in a factory where men like him were praised for their labor but never for their ideas. His father used to tell him, "You can't fight shadows, son, but you can outlast them." Marcus had carried that lesson with him for years. But tonight, as he sat alone, Marcus wondered if outlasting was enough. 2 weeks later, the board met behind closed doors to discuss Marcus's future. He wasn't invited to that meeting, but Marcus knew what the outcome would be before they even announced it. The official statement framed it as a mutual decision to part ways. Marcus's photo quietly disappeared from the website's leadership page. His name was removed from the corner office. By the time the press got hold of the story, Marcus was already packed and gone. 6 months later, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Harlem, sipping coffee as the morning sun crept through the window. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Atlantic Airlines announces new CEO following leadership shakeup. Marcus opened the article, scrolling until he found the part that mattered. Peterson had stepped in as interim CEO. Marcus smiled to himself, shaking his head. He had expected nothing less. Later that afternoon, Marcus walked along the streets of the neighborhood he grew up in. The buildings were older now, the paint peeling from the brick, but the streets felt the same. As he passed a small park, Marcus noticed a group of young boys playing basketball, their laughter echoing down the block. One of them missed a shot and cursed under his breath. "You'll get the next one," Marcus called out, offering a small nod. The boy glanced over, wiping sweat from his brow, and nodded back. Marcus kept walking. He knew there would always be another shot. And Marcus Gaines wasn't finished shooting yet.